Hello and welcome back to Tranquility du Jour, nourishing conversations about living a full and meaningful life with doses of tranquility. I'm your host, Kimberly Wilson, bringing you tranquility since 2005. So today we are talking with Dr. Rochelle Calvert about how nature helps heal trauma, ways to awaken in nature, somatic healing, and how to give back to nature. Prepare to be inspired. Before we dive in, a reminder to hit the subscribe button in your favorite podcast app, to visit kimberlywilson.com/568 for the show notes. And if you're new around here, a big welcome, and you can find out more about Tranquility du Jour at kimberlywilson.com/new. Also, be sure to check out the brand new annual program that I'm so excited to share with you. And you can find a link to this over in the show notes. Dr. Rochelle Calvert is certified in a variety of mindfulness, meditation, and trauma healing practices, and is the founder and clinical director of New Mindful Life. She lives in San Diego, California, and you can find more at newmindfullife.com. Welcome, Rochelle.
Thank you, Kimberly, for having me. So excited to be here.
Well, big congrats. And listeners, I'm holding up her beautiful book, Healing with Nature, Mindfulness and Somatic Practices to Heal from Trauma. And I love the cover, by the way. It's so gorgeous. So tell us a little bit, Rochelle, about your journey to writing this book.
Yeah. Well, as many healers in the field of healing, my own journey for healing is probably what really inspired this book, along with many, many clients that I've supported over the years who've struggled with trauma. But ultimately, knowing that we can suffer in so many different ways, and often trauma is the last thing that gets talked about. And how do we bring that to conscious conversation and have some skillful means by which to heal from that? And through my own experience and my clients, realizing, why aren't we looking to nature for more of that? You know, when we walk outside, we feel better. And if we're going to do this deep work that can be challenging sometimes when we're healing from trauma, what better container than nature and herself to support us in that healing? And so that really has been the journey to the inspiration for this book.
Beautiful. Well, you know, I feel like over the past maybe 3 to 5 years, like forest bathing, you know, has gotten a lot of attention. And so it's like, I mean, you can even become a certified forest bather, you know?
Yes.
And so,
which sounds great, right?
It does. It does sound great.
In that.
I know. It's funny. I've looked into it. It's actually pretty intense. But, you know, it's interesting that you are kind of like, I wouldn't say ahead of your time, but like you're going like right into this as a way to use it, not even just to like, you know, feel better, which is great, but actually to heal. Yeah. And, you know, we use the word trauma a lot, of course, in mental health. And I think most people know what it means. But for our listeners who may be like, what is trauma? Have I experienced trauma? Like, how do you define it? And can you give some examples of how it shows up for people?
Yeah. I think that we, as a collective, as a society, kind of underestimate what we could be understanding about what trauma actually is. I personally have the definition that trauma is something that we go through that was probably unexpected, something very difficult, distressing in our lives, that when we went through it, we maybe didn't have all the resources that we really needed to bear on that experience to come out of it on the other side, feeling like we were ourselves again, grounded, resourced, balanced, feeling at ease. And if we didn't have those things, enough resources to get through it, then ultimately we go on to experience blips of disruption in our life, whether that feels like, oh, relationships got a little harder, or my ability to just do the daily life things that I do got a little harder. And so as we go through life, we'll keep doing these coping ways to kind of hope to kind of get through whatever we got through as best we can, but maybe it wasn't enough and ultimately can go on to cause problems. So the definition then of the what that may have allowed that to be your experience is pretty wide. We classically think about it, and a lot of people will think about trauma as, oh, that's people who have PTSD or people who have been at war or experienced serious physical or sexual assault or, serious natural disasters. Those people went through trauma. But when you take a step back and you look at the definition from this part or this way, our nervous systems aren't readapting and going back to the way that they can live in health. And that can be a lot of different things, including, I will say, the biggest one that I think we're all sharing in the last year and a half has been this trauma of the pandemic. I mean, it continues to permeate ways that are unexpected, cause distress, allow us to feel out of control, push on the resources we have to bear on it. And who knows how we're doing with that, right? So it could be, collective things that we're going through that can feel traumatic, in addition to, emotional, abusive, dynamic situations, which could be at work, could be in your family. We could deal with challenges related to climate crisis as well. We can have a lot of trauma arise around the out of control unexpectedness of that. So really, it is whatever a person, and this is what I invite all my clients and people that I work with, is it's your definition. What fits within, what experiences in your life fit that I was not myself after that event, or I was not, the version of how I wanted to get through it with enough resources. And then it's likely that trauma is stuck in your body. And that really is a seminal piece of what I'm pointing to in the book to help people understand how we can release that from the body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. It's so helpful. And it's interesting you bring up the pandemic, right? From a collective experience, we're all going through this. And it will be interesting. I'm just curious, and there's no way to know, but what will be the effect, of this kind of long term? I mean, one positive thing that does seem to be coming out of it is people really doing a lot of reevaluating.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? In a way that, when else would you kind of hit the pause button because you were locked down at home, and then just be like, is this the life I want to live? Right. And so I think in a way that's been really powerful, but of course it's also been quite traumatic in a variety of ways.
And I'll add that the other thing I think that I've seen as a positive about it, in addition to that pause, is that a lot of us realized that maybe the resource we had because we were in lockdown was nature. Like the one thing people were doing more of was walking in their neighborhoods, planting gardens. Gardening got to be a very big, thing in this past year and a half because people could have a relationship to connection, to aliveness, to the things that we couldn't have as a society, maybe in the same ways we were used to, but we certainly could have it more directly with nature.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think it became massive soul balm for people.
Yes,
right?
Definitely. I love that.
So one of your chapters, of course, or your parts, is on awakening in nature. And so can you talk a little bit about how does one awaken in nature?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was spending some time just yesterday, actually, in a really beautiful garden near where I'm at right now. And I was watching people in the garden, looking for all the tags and the labels about what was this type of plant, and everybody was, oh, it's that kind of, and was with some people who aren't as familiar with what I do. And I just shared, it's beautiful to know the names, but it's also beautiful to experience being present to nature. So that's what I'm pointing to with awakening in nature. It's like, how can I be with what's here? And there's so many ways, and the practices of mindfulness invite us into fully being present with nature, which could be as simple as, what would it be like if you recognize that every breath you take, or just a couple for that matter, you're breathing in the oxygen of these living beings, right? And when you breathe back out, you are breathing back out carbon dioxide to those living beings. The breath itself, just awakening to our connection to nature just through the breath, is a very simple way to begin to feel that, oh, I am with nature. I can awaken to being with her. The senses, right? Rather than the mind needing to go, oh, that's that kind of bird or that's that kind of plant. Could you just let your eyes see, like receive seeing instead of the doing with the seeing, right? And that begins to awaken us to nature. We can, aliven the other senses. How often do we actually, I think nature is kind of good at alluring us to touch and to connect, right? And so are you just touching just to see, ooh, is it pokey or is it soft? Or are you really spending some time feeling present with what's it like to feel the softness, the texture, the connection of being like holding the hand of a plant, right? Or a tree. And so if we awaken to nature, it's really staying present to be with what's happening moment to moment a little longer than we might normally, or the way the mind is typically wanting to do it, so that we can begin to awaken into our bodies. We can begin to awaken into feeling more connection and aliveness and brightness about being with ourselves and with nature.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love the reminder about all the senses, right? I mean, it's great to know what kind of plant it is, but it's also great to be fully present. And, it makes me think too of, I love to take photos, right? So, but you're in nature or botanical gardens or in a forest and you're like, photo, 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 which is lovely, right?
Yes,
But it's also like, how can you be like in the experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And you'll miss it if you're just in the mind, right?
Right.
That, was hearing there was some water features, right? And I was just letting the sound of the water be part of what I was present to. And I actually could begin as I studied myself with that rather than just, it was very beautiful, but I could hear it. I could feel the current of the water starting to be like a vibration in my body, right? And these are from these practices and knowing that that's a very different way to connect and be in the experience of a garden and with myself and what's going on around me than just through that other doorway of the mind.
Absolutely. Yeah, the sound of water is so therapeutic.
It is. It is. Yes, there's actually research that says when we listen to just water for a bit or bird song, it improves our mood and improves our alertness. And which is great. Seems obvious when you think about it, because you go out and say, you're like, I love water. Why not? It is improving your mood. But then to learn these practices to be able to really use them for the healing potential that we can author for ourselves, just another lovely way to already incline ourselves to what we know feels helpful.
Right, right. Beautiful. Well, so tell us a little bit too about how does nature and maybe a little bit of the science, because I find it so interesting, right? How does nature help heal? And particularly, I mean, trauma, that's big.
Yeah, yeah. It's growing and it's a slowly evolving field, which to me feels like, what, how come it took us so long to figure out we should probably, we love science in so many other ways. Like most people will say, I love being outside, and how do we spend more time out there? That the research has just been slow to follow. But we do know, that we can actually improve our physiological well-being by the increased dose time that we spend out in nature, right? So I think it's about 5 or 10 minutes was the study I was just citing before about water or bird song that improves our mood or alertness. But when we start to spend things like a half an hour outside, we can actually begin to lower our stress cortisol levels. We can begin to, there's some research pointing to potential proactive benefits to prevent cancer. There are some research that's pointing to our overall satisfaction and well-being in life will improve when we spend longer amounts of time outside. And again, this kind of seems like somewhat obvious. Like, when you go on a hike, you feel better. Like you feel that I'm, just a little bit more nourished and my well-being feels overall improved. And then when we look at trauma specifically, the trauma research is really in both mindfulness and the somatic field. It's kind of slow to catch up with with nature and how that impacts trauma. But when we start to kind of put all the pieces together of what somatic research might be looking at and what mindfulness might be looking at, and how that layers into what nature research is looking at, we can begin to see that it's all kind of pointing to the same thing. We know that cortical structures will change when we practice being present, practicing mindfulness in our brains, in the parts of our brains that are wired up from trauma in ways that aren't healthy. Right. And so if we're spending time in nature practicing mindfulness, we're going to change those structures of our brain. We're going to change the physiology. That's the places I really get excited is, and it's been more potent in the mindfulness world, but they have been able to actually see that we can change the telomeres that are on our DNA. That actually begins to improve longevity in our life, prevents diseases in really healthy and functional ways when we practice mindfulness. And you think about all that research, what we're beginning to know about nature, what we know about the trauma field with the somatic research, we're just scratching the surface. But I really believe that all of it's going to point to, this continued benefit that we're changing our physiology at a core level that will sustain itself for our well-being.
Yeah, this is amazing.
Yeah.
What are some mindfulness practices that you would recommend that our listeners can try in nature? I love your example of being at the garden yesterday and, really paying attention from a sensory perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, the practices in the book build on themselves, right? So we're starting initially with mindfulness practices of the breath, and then the sensory doorways, seeing, touch, smell, hearing. And we then build up to the body awareness practices. And I would say that really is from the third chapter on through most of the rest of the book, we're referring back to those body awareness practices because that the body is the place that's holding the stuck trauma, right? And so if we can, practice these entry points of breath and sense awareness, but ultimately it's waking us up to be in our bodies. When was the last time that you asked yourself, how are my feet? We don't walk around unless they're stubbed or shoved in a shoe, we don't really connect to we have these amazing vehicles beneath us, if we're blessed with that, to be able to sense and experience walking, right? And what I teach in the book to help people begin to heal trauma is we've got to begin to safely wake up with being present in our bodies. So a really simple practice could be taking yourself on a walk, and taking yourself on a walk in a beautiful natural setting. Even if you don't have a huge park nearby, it can be just your neighborhood. And even if you live in an urban place, I promise the concrete is actually made of the earth. So it is formed from rock from the earth. We can connect to that. There are going to be trees somewhere. You can look up at the beautiful sky. And as you're walking, how can you attune to the sensations in your body? How do my feet feel while I'm walking? How do my arms move while I'm walking? How do my eyes gaze around rather than just, oh, that's nice, it's a tree. Oh, I'm scanning the environment right now. You can actually feel your eyes moving through the environment, feel your body moving through the environment. And what allures you, what in nature, you'll see something beautiful and your body naturally goes to it. Feel what it's like to inhabit your body going to that. And so we build practices, but being present in the body is such a beautiful way to, even if it's a couple of seconds, or sustained for that matter, either way, that's building that attunement to our bodies, which has this wisdom in it and our connection to it to allow us to heal from trauma. And nature's just providing a beautiful way to wake up to it.
And one of the things you talk a lot about, of course, in the book is somatic healing. And can you talk a little bit about what is somatic healing and how does that show up in nature for us?
Yeah. So Peter Levine, author of Waking the Tiger, 30 plus years ago now, saw that we are nature too. And nature, he began to study nature and say, all these other creatures out there have these beautiful capacities to heal themselves and move on with life. They're not stuck and trapped in the way that our minds really want to run the show. And so the theory is that, becoming more aware and present and alive in our bodies gives us a chance to begin to connect to where the stuck trauma may live and to ultimately be able to heal and release that so we feel more ourselves again. And so somatic healing is just that. It's the ability to learn how to safely be present to our bodies. And that takes some time and some trust in building the awareness practices. So it's why the mindfulness practices are at the front of the book, to help people just begin to get a sense of what it's like to start getting curious about being in one's body so that we can begin to explore the somatic healing. Because a lot of times with trauma, people are wanting to check out from what's stuck in the body. It feels so uncomfortable or so unbearable that it's easier to just let the mind run the show and, take us on different patterns and paths that try to avoid or distance or disconnect from our experience in our bodies. So somatic healing, I'm teaching practices to safely inhabit the body again and to discover where that actual trauma is in your body without the narrative, without the narrative of how that trauma came to be. This is a very different approach than some other trauma-informed approaches in the psychological world. I think it's one that's really gaining in a sense of individual capacity, because you don't really need a therapist. We don't need to go back to the story. We need to listen to the body. And so we can begin to learn these practices for ourselves so that when we can learn to trust how to go towards what's stuck or not feeling as alive for us in our bodies and use some very specific practices that you're taught in the book, you can begin to experience the healing and actually feel the trauma releasing from your body. A couple of those practices are grounding practices where we can actually feel like we can land safely in safe parts of our bodies and establish that so that then we can move our attention to the places that are stuck. So I often give the example of I was in a car accident, a pretty significant one, quite a number of years ago. And so have a fair amount of stuckness that can happen in my neck at times. And through my own work and own exploration, it's not just the car accident, it's related to historical traumas in my life as well that have also impacted my neck. But if I'm having a moment like where my body maybe has had a stress reaction to something, that can get a little tight. And so I can use this practice, what's called pendulation, of focusing on what's grounded, but being able to go to the source of where in my neck it might feel really stuck and use that pendulation practice, going back and forth, that ultimately allows me to explore where the healing needs to go to release that stuckness from my body. So really what we're doing in sections 2 and 3 of the book is exploring skillful means to do that so that you can feel like you can be your own author of kind of going in and awakening your real true nature, letting the body release what doesn't serve it, what's been in the way and creating a lot of reactive patterns from the trauma.
It's interesting. The being in your body, right, versus your head is such a powerful technique and yet also so challenging, right? Because we spend so much time in our head. That's what allows us to be productive members of society. And yet it also keeps us stuck.
Yeah.
And, oftentimes, like for my clients, if they're trying to make a decision or, contemplate a next step, asking them to, picture yourself doing A, how does that feel on your body? Picture yourself doing B, how does that feel on your body? Because sometimes the pro-conning in the head just does not do it. Yeah, and so I'm curious for you. Yeah, it can be helpful if people can go there. And so I'm curious for you, is there any other practice that you would encourage our listeners to try, particularly if they're like, I don't know how to feel in my body, right? Because it's not easy.
Yes. Yeah. And I get asked often, especially because a lot of times the way we've gone about coping is to disconnect, like literally purposely. I feel quite pleasant being somewhere else. So why would I come back to the body? So it can feel very like, that doesn't feel like a good idea. But this is where I feel like the resource of nature is so useful, because if we're practicing outside, it's just a little, there's like an allure, or it's easier. It just like doesn't have to be effortful to be in one's body. And so you can move with nature, right? Like I mentioned earlier about walking, but maybe you just want to spend, 2 or 3, maybe it's longer minutes, hanging out with a place in nature that just is exciting to you. You're like, oh, it's so pretty. Like there's a little patch of just kind of beautiful little tiny flowers that were growing on this ground cover, right? And I just got down with that and spent a little time touching, feeling, looking at all the different colors and the different light displays that were happening. And that was being in my body. It didn't need to be a lot of work. I could just, check in with, oh, what's that feel like on my hand? Oh, what's it like to receive the softness, right? The little pillowy, tiny little leaves and green and flowers, right? And then asking myself in that moment, oh, what's that feel like in my body, right? And I could feel my heart open a little bit, and I could feel my breath take a little bit of a deeper, slower sense to it. And that's it, and then we're in our bodies. That is, presence to what's here now, connecting to it in a simple way that feels safe, and then asking yourself, and what does that feel like in my body, right? And that's enough. And then we grow that over time. I was speaking to a client recently, and they were really wanting to do the practices right and do them a lot. And I said, there was an intention in the way that I wrote the book that I'm asking people to start with 2 or 3 minutes. Maybe somewhere around chapters 9, 10, 11, I'm saying maybe you try 20 or 30 minutes. There's no reason to force our way. This is the mind, right? The mind is like, hey, get in there and do something. But this is what's kind of caused the problem. So trying to use it in the same way to get into the body isn't helpful. So we want to safely decide, 30 seconds feels good, or 2 minutes feels good, and then be done, move on, right? To wake up into that sense of being in one's body.
Yeah, beautiful. And one of the pieces that you talk, a whole part really at the end of the book is, about giving back, right, to nature. And it's great to take from nature. It's great to be connected to nature. But then how do we give back, especially with everything going on right now, of course, with climate change and we're daily bombarded with disaster.
Yeah.
So what can we do to actually make a difference?
Yeah. Yeah, I hope that by exploring the practices in the book, you're touched by something in nature, right? I know that for myself, this book is a product of my own practice and being touched by nature and realizing there could be a way that if we could heal our own trauma enough, wake up to our own sense of wholeness enough, that we would feel that inclination for the earth to have the same experience, right? That she's under threat, she's under trauma from, some of our unconsciousness. And so, whatever anybody's own experience of these practices is, if they're touched in some way, that can be where their entry point is to giving back, right? Let's just say, you found great joy in your heart being able to light up from a beautiful yellow flower. There was some meaningful practice moment that occurred for you in your healing journey with a yellow flower. Maybe you're conscious about wanting to plant yellow flowers as a way to honor what nature gave to you to help you to feel healed. But when we plant and we give back and we till the soil and we're attentive to helping to create more oxygen, health on the planet, that's a way to give back. Very simple way. You may be profoundly touched. I, grew up in the Central Valley of California. It's a huge agricultural belt of California. And there's a lot of destruction that's happened to the environment there due to that agriculture. I grew up on a farm that was participating in that, right? And so some of my calling and my work beyond this work has been to be able to give back to how do we have healthier farming practices? How do we, invest energy and time in that way, right? So again, healing my own trauma to see where, the relationship of my connection to nature is a beautiful place that I grew up in that absolutely will always live in my heart, but also a very beautiful place for me to spend energy giving back to healing the planet. So whatever anyone's own personal journey is, I think that's where we wake up to help. It doesn't need to be, I need to go join, green peas, or maybe you do, but whatever feels best for you, because at your place of where you're feeling healing, touched, and inspired, that's where we give back and do our part.
Beautiful. Well, my last question for you, Rochelle, is the name of this podcast is Tranquility du Jour. And so I'm curious, how are you finding tranquility in your everyday, especially you're in transition right now? Before we started recording, you mentioned you're moving from San Diego to Taos, which is so exciting, but also a bit disheveling.
It's transition. It's a lot of transition every day. Yeah. Oh, that's and I love the name of your podcast, Tranquility du Jour. How do we choose it? How do we make sure that we're cultivating that in our lives? I think for me right now, it has been just to be committed to sitting a little every day, right? I do this every day in daily life that is a normal routine, but my routine has been far from normal. And so it's been a fun practice to just, wherever I'm at, whatever the transition that's going on is, choosing to say, okay, I'm in a new place right now. We were driving out to Colorado, or through Colorado the other couple of days ago. And I just said, practice time is 8 a.m. We're pulling over wherever we are on the side of the road. We're practicing, connecting to the nature that was there in that particular moment at that particular place. And so it's just reminding myself that the choice is that I can practice. I can take these, whatever, especially from, I'm sure your listeners have had lots of different tastes of things that help them feel tranquil and support them. But for me, that's spending a little time in nature, practicing mindfulness and somatic work. And so wherever that is, just making sure that's a commitment to myself every single day, no matter what's going on. And the other thing I would say that I found tranquility with lately is making sure I dance. I love to dance. And it would be in my normal routine, but it's certainly harder to do when you're not in your normal abode and how it typically feels. And so I just turn on a little music and make sure that gets into my nervous system and into my body and let myself move. Yeah.
So powerful. Moving your body through dance is so powerful. Yes.
Definitely. Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much, Rochelle, for being here and writing this gorgeous book. So well done.
And thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to share.
So check out our guest on Facebook, on YouTube, and then, of course, her book. And there are links to all of this in the show notes. And let's stay connected also through my regular love notes, where you get invites, inspiration. You're the first to know what's going on. Browse my 6 books and planner for those of you looking for ways to make your 2022 more tranquil. There's also my social media links. Mainly, I'm on Instagram with occasional videos on YouTube. Also, a link to Shop TDJ, which is a locally sewn, eco-friendly clothing line that I've had since 2002. And then finally, if you have a moment to share a review of this podcast, I'd be so grateful. And or pin a review on Amazon or Goodreads of any of my books. Would be so grateful. And I appreciate your support. I appreciate you tuning in. And I appreciate you inviting me and Dr. Calvert into your day. Have a great week.